For over a century, Hollywood was a cathedral for storytelling, a towering engine of imagination that defined generations through its fearless characters, unforgettable dialogue, and bold artistic risks. People didn't go to the movies to be reminded of the world they already lived in. They went because, for a few hours, the lights would dim, the screen would flicker to life, and everything else would disappear. There was no need to analyze whether a story was inclusive enough or morally perfect. If it made you laugh, cry, or see something differently, then it did its job. That was the only standard that mattered. But here's the thing. The machine started breaking long before anyone noticed. And what we now call woke culture didn't create these cracks. It simply filled them. Before the culture wars, before the hashtags, before the backlash, beneath the surface of red carpets and box office celebrations, the system was quietly rotting from within. Think about it. When was the last time you left a theater genuinely surprised by what you just seen? Creativity was replaced by caution, innovation gave way to repetition, and studios became obsessed with familiarity. Remakes, sequels, spin-offs, and cinematic universes that recycled the same formulas under different titles, year after year. Writers were discouraged from taking chances. The result was a creative drought, not because audiences lost their love for stories, but because Hollywood stopped trusting them. This creative bankruptcy created a vacuum that was waiting to be filled. When you stop believing in the power of storytelling itself, you start looking for other ways to justify your existence. And here's where it gets interesting. You start measuring success by metrics that have nothing to do with whether people actually want to watch what you're making. Box office numbers became secondary to cultural approval ratings. Industry awards became more important than audience connection. Critical acclaim mattered more than emotional impact. Hollywood was already learning to value everything except the one thing that had made it great in the first place. And then 2020 happened. When the pandemic shut down the world, production paused, theaters closed, and it forced an entire industry to confront how fragile it had become. Hollywood, for all its money and power, was not prepared. Films that were years in the making, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, were shelved or quietly buried. Streaming surged. But here's the kicker. Profitability plummeted. Theater chains collapsed. Independent cinemas closed permanently. The entire ecosystem that had supported film culture for decades was suddenly gone. What remained? A handful of streaming platforms fighting over a shrinking pool of subscribers. As the industry scrambled to stay afloat, it leaned even further into nostalgia, trying to squeeze the last drops of interest from franchises that were already running on fumes. Instead of returning to the fundamentals of great storytelling, Hollywood found refuge in a new kind of certainty: ideological alignment. And this is crucial to understand. Woke culture didn't sneak in and corrupt the system. It was invited in, embraced, and eventually enshrined as a kind of moral insurance policy. Inclusion became an industry mandate. Scripts were filtered through layers of consultants and committees. Characters were evaluated not just by their role in the plot, but by how well they represented current social values. Film sets adopted codes of ideological conduct that went far beyond the boundaries of storytelling. Marketing departments began crafting campaigns around social justice messaging rather than the entertainment value of the films themselves. But wait, it gets worse. The transformation was swift and thorough. Studios that had once prided themselves on pushing boundaries now spent millions ensuring they didn't cross any lines. Writers' rooms became echo chambers where certain ideas couldn't even be discussed, let alone explored. Directors found themselves explaining their creative choices to committees of executives who measured artistic merit by how well it aligned with current social movements. The very people responsible for creating culture were now terrified of it. Now, here's the irony. Many of the values behind this shift weren't new, nor were they inherently harmful. Representation, respect, awareness. These are not the enemies of art. But when they're weaponized as branding tools or used to replace genuine emotion and layered characters, they become distractions, not just from the story, but from the people those stories are supposed to speak to. When diversity becomes a checklist item rather than an organic part of storytelling, the audience can sense the artifice immediately. And they did. Audiences began to feel this long before they could articulate it. They sat in front of screens and sensed that something was missing. The performances were polished, the visuals impressive, the production values sky high. And yet, they left the theater feeling nothing. The emotional weight that defined great cinema had been drained out, replaced by dialogue that felt like corporate statements and characters who seemed more like ideological representatives than human beings. This isn't about politics. It's about permission. The permission to be flawed, to be complex, to tell a story that might upset some people or make others uncomfortable or even offend. Because that's what great stories do. They disrupt, they question, they provoke, they live in the gray areas and ask the audience to wrestle with them. And somewhere along the way, Hollywood forgot that. The industry that once celebrated rebels and misfits, that built its reputation on stories about people who refused to conform, had become utterly obsessed with conformity. In the rush to be on the right side of cultural conversation, the industry began policing its own instincts. Scripts were rewritten to remove conflict, not just interpersonal conflict, but the internal contradictions that make characters human. Casting choices were dictated by demographics rather than chemistry or narrative logic. Comedians were told what they could joke about. Directors lost control of their own projects to focus groups and corporate committees. Public apologies became part of the job description for anyone who dared to step outside the prescribed boundaries. And instead of making better films, the industry made films that felt apologetic, nervous, and engineered for damage control. You want proof? Look at the numbers. Franchises that once ruled the box office now struggle to break even. Disney's live-action remakes like Snow White have gone from safe investments to cautionary tales, generating more controversy than box office revenue. We're talking about a film that reportedly cost over $200 million and became a social media battleground before it even hit theaters. Marvel's golden touch is fading fast. Films like Captain America: Brave New World feel more obligatory than exciting, each new release carrying the weight of political messaging rather than the thrill of adventure. Remember when a new Marvel movie was an event? Now they feel like homework. Studios like Netflix pump out content at an unsustainable pace. Over 15,000 hours of original content per year, most of it forgotten within a week, desperately hoping that quantity might compensate for the lack of quality. The audience, once loyal and forgiving, has become skeptical and selective. They've been told too many times that the next big release will be important, groundbreaking, or historic. But when the lights go down and the film begins, it often feels hollow, manufactured, focus grouped into mediocrity. And here's the real tragedy. This doesn't elevate anyone. It doesn't elevate the communities being represented, who deserve authentic portrayals rather than token gestures. It doesn't elevate the writers, directors, or actors who are genuinely trying to do meaningful work, but find themselves constrained by institutional requirements. It doesn't elevate the industry, which has traded its reputation for fearless storytelling for the temporary safety of moral posturing. Hollywood, for all its influence, has forgotten what it means to take a real creative risk. Not a casting choice that earns headlines or a plot twist designed to generate controversy, but the kind of risk that says, this might not work, this might upset people, but it's honest. That kind of honesty can't be approved by a committee. It can't be faked with good intentions or focus grouped into acceptability. It has to come from somewhere deeper, from artists who care more about truth than trends, more about connection than compliance. The irony is that the solution is simple, even if it's not easy. Hollywood doesn't need to abandon its values. It needs to stop turning them into substitutes for substance. Stop measuring a film's worth by how well it aligns with the cultural moment. Stop using social ideology as a shield against valid criticism. Stop assuming that audiences are either bigoted or broken if they don't respond to your message. Start listening to what they're actually saying, which is that they want to be moved, not manipulated. Because audiences aren't confused. They're just tired of being ignored, talked down to, and treated like children who need to be educated rather than entertained. They can tell the difference between a story that naturally includes diverse perspectives and one that feels engineered to hit demographic targets. They can sense when a film cares more about its message than its characters, and they're increasingly willing to vote with their wallets. Woke culture didn't destroy Hollywood, but it arrived at a time when Hollywood was already falling apart, creatively exhausted, financially bloated, and desperate for relevance. And instead of fixing the real problems, the industry embraced a new identity that made it feel noble, progressive, and unassailable. That identity now hangs like a fog over the entire system, dulling everything it touches, making even genuine artistic attempts feel calculated and corporate. The filmmakers who will rise in this era aren't the ones who learn to navigate that fog. They're the ones who push through it, the ones who tell the truth, who write what they believe, not what they think they're supposed to believe, who care more about emotion than optics, more about story than hashtags, more about connection than compliance. They may not be embraced by the industry at first, but they will be remembered. Hollywood, at its best, was never about perfection. It was about the beauty and brutality of being human. That's the part the industry needs to remember. That's the part that matters. And until it finds its way back to that fundamental truth, the decline will continue, because no amount of branding, messaging, or self-congratulation can replace the power of a story that dares to be real,